been the big problem. We're isolated. What are we going to do here? We can't get information. What's going on outside of this community? How do I get out and find out? You know, how do I move to the city where I can extract information from other people so I can emulate them and do cool things in my own life? And every time people did move to the cities, glorious things resulted. You know, they learn from each other, they share information, and it becomes a driving force, the energy, the power behind innovation and development and improvement of our lives and of commerce. So this is why I'm just very optimistic and excited about what the digital age means to us, because, you know, we've all moved to the city. Everyone all over the world, we've all moved to the city, one big, wonderful city of vast information sharing. And nothing like this has ever happened in human history. I think we're right to expect enormous surprises as a result of this dramatic move to the city. Things we don't expect. And I know that probably you have, you know, because you're attending the seminar, you have a libertarian impulse and a desire to see humanity liberated from its chains. And there's many chains, and they're tightening and growing and strengthening every day. The state is growing all over the developed world. But we can't forget that really in the end, the state only has one thing, and that's it's coercive power. And that's the least desirable thing to have, actually. Far more powerful and interesting is the capacity of humanity to innovate, to learn, to share, to improve. Humanity is the grass that seems to always spring up between the cracks and the sidewalk. You know, that is the state. You know, the pavement, that is the state. And, you know, if that weren't true, we'd never see any advances, ever, because the state is always working against the advance of humanity, and humanity itself is always trying to advance. And look at this. We've advanced. What this shows is that we're winning the day. The seminar today is on intellectual property, and I just want to kind of give you a warning at the outset that I don't expect that you'll agree with me. In fact, I expect there'll be a lot of disagreements, and a lot of things I say might rub you the wrong way, because it's a difficult topic in some strange way. I don't think in 50 years this is going to be a difficult topic. I think it'll be an inevitable topic, and everything I say tonight will just be commonplace. But we live in strange times, leaving this analog age where the powers that be were always trying to control information flows and control ideas. And they've done it for several hundred years, and they've been a little bit successful at this. That's all changed now in the world of the internet, because we have now a technology that has taken essentially the power of copying to new levels, to unthinkable levels. And, whoops, pardon me. And, try that again here. Okay. And if you want to think about what is the internet, people ask, you know, what is it? Well, it's just a big copying machine. That's what it is. And saying this, I'm quoting the words of Aaron Schwartz, who said that this is the essence of the internet. You know, you put something on one server, and then you can send it to another server, and that server can make a copy, and then that server goes to the router and sends it out to other servers, and then it lands on new desktops, and they can send it out to new servers. And that's the essence of the internet. Whatever that thing is can be reproduced and replicated unto infinity. And I'm not sure how, yeah, I'm really sorry about this. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. So I'm not sure how well this was understood in the old days when the internet first came along, but it's ever more obvious now. And essentially this has sent states of the world into a kind of panic, and not just states, but those industries that rely on the state for doing business the old way instead of doing the business the new way. So that my thesis here is that it's possible to do business in the world of digital communication without using the state as the key thing to artificially scarcify your product. That's the thesis, and that's what we're essentially dealing with here. So let me point out first of all why this thing matters in the first place, why the subject of intellectual property matters, and why just thinking about it will open up new vistas for you in terms of your research and your understanding of the world itself. So every day the state is out there trying to crack down. And the state has been doing, the war on piracy now is 10 years old. The power elite, saw that there was a kind of what they imagined to be a problem, vast sharing of digital goods, reproducing them unto infinity, wrecking markets, creating infinite supply where they really wanted restricted supply, threatening bottom lines. This all began really at the outset of the age of the internet, but the state's response really began about 10 years ago. So you can't watch a movie now without being threatened. It's like, oh, well, I'm sitting down here to watch my great movie, and the very first like 3 things you see are like a warning that you're going to be shot on the spot, and if you copy this. So you didn't really even have the desire to copy it. You're just trying to watch a stupid movie, and instead you get a gun pointed to your head saying, we think you might be a bad guy, so don't copy this. And I'm sure it's true in Europe too, but certainly in the U.S., websites are taken down, practically every day for distributing what they call counterfeit products or being, not legitimate websites. I think it was last fall, the U.S. government raided the home of Kim.com in New Zealand, who's not even a New Zealand citizen, in a military-style raid, and captured him because he was running, a server that allowed people to share their own possessions. They tried to prosecute the guy, and why? Just because he permitted people to share information. And the war on piracy of all forms, whether it's pirating music or pirating texts or pirating counterfeit products, whatever they think is selling counterfeit products. Another big one is counterfeit drugs or unauthorized drug distribution, legal drugs I'm talking about. I remember in the early days of the internet, I was really excited because I thought, oh, for God's sake, you may not know this, but prescription drug restrictions in the U.S. are extremely outrageous. I mean, like, I can go to practically any country in the world and get, antibiotics over the counter or whatever else you need. In the U.S., you can't do this. I mean, the cartel is very strict, so that if I've got a cough, and I know that I just need a zithromycin or something to get over it, I've got to go in and pay the doctor a lot of money so he can write a slip of paper to tell me what I already know. Then I take that. It's like communism. Then take that slip of paper down to a little store, and then they give me the drug. And so I was really excited. I thought, well, great, with the internet, we're not going to need this nonsense anymore. Well, there's a big crackdown on online drugstores too, all of which fights against the consumer's interests. So this war on piracy has become absolutely brutal. There was a case just a few weeks ago, really, and I wrote like 3 articles on the topic of Aaron Schwartz, who was a great innovator. He was the guy who came up with the idea of RSS feeds when he was like 14 or something, and was a co-founder of Reddit and founded many, and that just a real evangelist for the tools that we have. And he was hounded by the U.S. Justice Department for hiding a laptop at the Massachusetts Institute for Technology and downloading JSTOR articles, which is stuff published over the last 100 years, research published over the last 100 years. And so they hounded him to the point of bankruptcy and threatening him with 30 or maybe even 40 years in jail for this. And he began to despair about about what was happening, and eventually took his life. But which is like a deeply tragic loss, something that's affected me very personally, really. I can't stop listening to his speeches and his talks. Very sweet. He was only 26 years old. I mean, the guy was just a genius. But the state drove him to despair and cut down effectively, one of the great minds of our time. But it's not just that. I mean, the patent wars that are going on are gigantically expensive. We've got whole software companies, rather than innovating and serving consumers, are spending all their time suing each other, spending billions of dollars acquiring other people's patent war chests as a defensive measure. The copyright police are keeping, essentially 70 years worth of literature that could be available to you and me, doing their best to keep it offline. And this is the equivalent of the burning of the Library of Alexandria or something. I mean, here we have a chance for universal sharing of information, and we're not taking them. It kind of embarrasses me in a way to kind of be alive in these times. I mean, because I know that in 50 or 100 years, they're going to look back at this generation and go, what the heck were those people thinking? This is sheer insanity. What were they doing? Well, what we're doing is extremely idiotic, and it's contrary to human rights, and contrary to human liberty, and contrary to economic development in many ways. But that's why it matters. But my point is this, after 10 years of this nonsense, we find that on the internet today that pirated goods, for the lack of a better term, are more available than ever. I mean, I've never been more able to download movies, even movies that came out just a couple of days ago. I can stream them online. I can download practically any book. I can really go, do whatever I want. I mean, there's more availability than ever. So the war hasn't worked. I mean, it's very much like the war on drugs or any of the other government's wars. They set out to do one thing, and like the result is, actually the opposite. So that's where we stand. And if you believe in free markets, if you believe in human freedom, and you believe in genuine property rights rather than fake property rights, this whole subject becomes extremely important because fundamentally, and I think this is really the bottom line here, the war on the battle to preserve intellectual property and the war on those who the state sees as violators of intellectual property rights, actually what stands in the balance is really the digital age. All the things that you and I can do today with our smartphones, or with this webinar, or with networks that are growing and becoming more complex and beautiful and fabulous by the day, it's all under attack in the name of intellectual property. And so really everything kind of hangs in the balance. I don't believe that the state can win this, but in the course of trying to enforce this old-time idea of intellectual property rights, it can create vast costs, huge costs of human lives. There are people languishing in jail for no good reason. People are afraid to innovate. Nobody really knows what the law is anymore, and as is the case with the war on drugs or the war on guns or anything else, what happens is that the people who have an impulse towards compliance are overly cautious. So I get emails all the time of people asking my permission to link to an article that I've written. I mean, what? I mean, I only publish into the comments. It's the only way I publish these things. Of course you can link to my article. I mean, why would you even need to ask? And the fact is the law doesn't require them to ask, really, not really. But everybody's scared. I mean, so you've got this kind of fear factor, that's resulted from this ridiculous war in vast ways. We're seeing a slowing down of innovation in the software industry and in every industry as a result of this. So it behooves us, I think, to get really clear, especially people who have an attachment to the idea of human freedom and free markets need to get clear on this idea of patent and copyright. And we haven't really been, whoops, one second. And we haven't really been clear on this so far. One of the reasons is that in the history of liberalism, generally speaking, old-time liberalism, it hasn't really been that big of an issue. There were controversies in England, there were controversies in Germany, there were controversies in the US, but for the most part, the classical liberals didn't write about the topic a whole lot, or at least not with a great deal of passion, because it wasn't that important. It's only become gigantically important in our time because of this infinite, universally distributed copy machine we call the internet has made it, and because this copy machine is so crucial to economic development, has made the issue vastly more important than it used to be. So, and by the way, I should say that, you know, my views on this do have a precedent. I mean, if you look back just at the writings of, say, F.A. Hayek, okay, so he didn't write about this topic a whole lot, but there's a few comments here and there, constitutional liberty, law, legislation, and liberty, where he specifically says that copyright and patent are government-created monopolies and incompatible with the idea of human liberty. Okay, he just says this right out. He doesn't elaborate to any great extent, but I think he was exactly right about that. Fritz Machlup, who was a great Austrian economist and contemporary of Ludwig Mises, wrote a study in which he said the patents don't, this was back in the 1940s, in which he said that the patents don't actually help economic development. They contribute nothing, really. So he had some comments. Murray Rothbard was an excellent opponent of patents and wrote about them as essentially industrial monopolies. And Rothbard thought that, you know, you could have copyright, but it would have to be a common law copyright, something that was enforced solely through contract and not through state legislation. I think even Menger, you know, you can read Menger in a way in his first chapter of Principles of Economics that comes to the conclusion that intellectual property is not real property. It doesn't actually pass his test of what constitutes a scarce good. So I think there's precedent for these views, but nonetheless, it's up to this generation, you and me, to do the hard work on this subject because it's such an important topic and our intellectual predecessors only just barely touched on it in passing. Okay, so that finished my introductory remarks. I'm going to kind of structure the rest of the talk this way. I'm going to talk just briefly about the history of patent and copyright. I'm going to talk about the myth of the sole creator and history, the relationship between intellectual monopolies and feudalism, and talk about how IP works, how commerce works in a non-IP world, and then conclude with some large implications for economic and social theory. And as usual, my time's going by much faster than I wanted to. Okay, so the history of patent and copyright. You know, it's funny when you look at this whole history because you can always find examples of patent and copyright in human history dating all the way back into the ancient world. And the reason for that is that there's always a producer out there who's anxious for a monopoly of some sort. You know, capitalists really typically don't really fully believe in capitalism, you know, because competition tends to reduce their profits. So they prefer monopolies to competition. And if they can go to the government and say, hey, give me a monopoly on this, that kind of relieves their pressure to innovate and gives, you know, and the government gets sort of credit for the provision of the good and probably usually, in most cases, gets a kickback for this kind of arrangement. So these kind of arrangements date back to the ancient world. Patent, in particular, became of supreme relevance during the Industrial Revolution because we began to see, why was this? It was because we began to see innovation for the first time in a very long time. We tend to forget how human history was not particularly innovative, and I mean not much really happened until the late Middle Ages. So as soon as we started seeing these innovations, we began to see capitalists or industrial innovators of one sort or another going to the government and asking to be the sole producer. In other words, it is an extension of feudalism and mercantilism, where the economy was locked down and not free, and the government was in a position to permit, you know, one silk importer into a particular town, in exchange for which, you know, the government would agree to keep all its other silk importers out, thereby guaranteeing the profits of the silk importer, and the silk importer gives the prince a kickback. And that's basically it. That's what happened at the Industrial Revolution in England. It's what happened in the U.S. Typically, these were always favors granted by the crown to particular producers. In the case of copyright, they began, the institution of copyright in modern history anyway, began with the religious wars in England as a method of censorship. So, you know, Queen Mary's in charge. She's, you know, in charge of the presses. Who gets to print what? She doesn't like the Protestants and the Puritans, so she suppresses her work. And then Elizabeth comes in, takes over that legislation, and does the reverse. You know, she gives all the privileges to the Catholics. Well, I'm sorry, to the Protestants at the expense of the Catholics. You know, so it becomes like a tool of essentially censoring people. Not something designed, copyright's a little different from patent, because patents are typically designed to reward certain firms and industries and innovations. Copyright was typically designed to reward not composers and authors and writers, but rather to reward particular printers of their work who don't like pirate. And it's funny, you know, you read the history of copyright, you see that, like at the early age of printing in England, that the publishers that were printing new works were really against the publishers that were printing old works or reprinting old works. And they would make arguments to the crown like, we've got to stop these crazy pirates, because if they're allowed to print these old works, then people will just buy the old works. They won't buy the new works. That'll destroy our bottom line, ruin our profitability scheme, and we'll all be sunk. And then, if we can't pay our producers and our creators, then they won't create anything. You know, so you've got to grant a monopoly to stop these pirate publishers from publishing old works. I mean, it's a very funny argument, you know, going back 300 years, because it mirrors exactly the same kind of nonsense you have today. The key to understanding the history of patent and copyright, this is the most important thing to understand, is that they always extend from legislation. They wouldn't exist in absence of legislation. So in that sense, they're completely different from regular copyrights. I mean, you know, imagine a state of nature, you know, which maybe existed some 500,000 years ago or something like that, and people decided they wanted to domesticate animals and grow some crops. You homestead the land. It's your job to defend your property, you know, against other people. Social norms emerge that, okay, you don't trespass against my property, you don't steal my sheep, you know, I won't steal your sheep. No state is really necessary to bring about property rights. But intellectual property rights would not exist in absence of the state, because there's simply no way to enforce them. And that's because they have a different character, intellectual property rights, from real property rights. The main thing is that intellectual property rights always and everywhere coerce third parties that have nothing to do with that transaction. So, let me give you an example. Whatever sentence I'm saying right now, at least under American law, is technically copyright by me, right? So if you decide to say that same sentence, you're in violation of my copyright. You're an infringer on my copyright. By the way, everything I'm saying is in the comments, so please feel free to steal my words. But the point is that if somebody didn't hear what I'm saying, that person too would be bound by copyright to not say the same sentence. In other words, I become the sole owner of it. Whether a person has had access to what I'm saying or not, that person is also coercively prohibited from repeating what I have. So in other words, it's like a monopoly grant of privilege. And it has to be that way, because information and music and images and everything that we associate with copyright are essentially infinite goods. they can be infinitely reproduced. And the only way to stop that from happening, finally, is to coerce third parties into not using them. So that's the nature of intellectual property. That's why intellectual property requires legislation, whereas real property would exist, just through the normal development of human evolution, even in the absence of a state. That's the most important thing. Now, in the course of, so this is the origin of intellectual property. On the one hand, industrial monopolies for patents. On the other hand, censorship for copyright. But in the course of time, of course, you have to invent other rationales, because you can't just say, well, we want government monopolies. I mean, after all, mercantilism and feudalism came to an end in the age of capitalism. So sorry, I got my settings wrong a little bit. My computer keeps shutting up. So feudalism and mercantilism came to an end in the age of capitalism, and that was a great thing. We developed, a new affection in the 18th century, a new affection for free trade, and for property rights, and for the merits of free markets and freedom generally. In order to preserve things like intellectual property, you essentially had to have a new rationale, a new basis for the existence of these institutions, copyright and patent. So there was born the myth of the sole creator. The idea that, if a person comes up with a thing, then he or she is the great creator of this new thing, and therefore deserves somehow, as a matter of justice, to be the sole owner of this thing as a kind of a reward, for doing something marvelous to advance society. And this is essentially a myth. In fact, I think my article today on Laissez Faire today at lfb.org actually discusses this myth of the sole creator. That's not the way innovations happen. Let's just look at music, for example. Growing out of the late Middle Ages, sharing tunes and sharing innovations was the way musicians made progress. So people would listen to a Gregorian chant, add a separate line to it, come up with a new thing called organum. People would listen to the organum, add another line to it, call it polyphony. People would quote each other's tunes, learn from each other, add to the things. So you get this kind of seamless path of development that really can't be stopped in any one place. So nobody said to, Palestrina, oh my goodness, that is an amazing piece of music. Here's your industrial monopoly, your artistic monopoly granted privilege from the state to be the sole innovator of polyphonic music. It's ridiculous. And in fact, the whole history of music is a history of copying and emulating and improving a little bit at a time. You had like bursts of brilliance that would come along, Mozart, Beethoven, and Brahms, and Bird, and other great names in the history of composition that would emerge, that would sort of stand out above the rest. But for every one of these people that stood out, there were hundreds and hundreds of imitators who may have improved it at the margin. I mean, there wouldn't have been Bach without a Buxtehude, for example. There wouldn't have been a Brahms without a Beethoven, and so on. So yes, these people were innovative, but they were innovative based on a foundation of copying, of emulation. And without that ability to copy, you would see a kind of a diminution in creativity taking place. And that's precisely what we've seen in the age of copyright. By the way, all the composers I just mentioned to you, they all composed without any access to copyright whatsoever. I'm not saying that any of them got rich, but composers don't get rich today either. Composing music is not a very lucrative path for anybody except Wagner and maybe Hans Zimmer today for the movies. But it's a pretty rare thing for a composer to make any money anyway. But the point is that these people didn't stop creating. Of course they didn't stop creating. They learned from everything around them and built on it. It's the same thing in the area of technology. There's never been, the world of Atlas Shrugged, where one guy holds the whole key to making this great energy source work and nobody else can figure it out. I mean, it makes a nice story, and it's a brilliant archetype of what's fantastic about innovation in society. But actually, it is just an archetype. John Galt is a symbolic figure representing the whole of all the creators in the world. It's just simply not the case that in any field, only one person is endowed with some special magical quality to make something out of nothing. It's just not true. All innovation occurs at the margin in real life. So this myth of the sole creator is basically manufactured as a kind of a fraudulent means to support intellectual property, whereas the reality is that every innovation in history, whether it's musical or artistic or literary, for that matter, it kind of occurs in layers. People copying each other, improving just slightly. Maybe there's a little bit of fallback and a push forward. And if at any point you stop that innovation, this is true for the steam engine, for flight, for every innovation history, if you stop that innovation, what you see is a slowing down of progress. So people can't emulate and copy and market and improve the product. And that's precisely what the result of IP has been in all times and places. It's been a slowing down of progress. So every form of mercantilism, feudalism has been more or less sort of abandoned in the modern age until we get to intellectual property, which has been not only preserved, but tightened to the point of absurdity in our own times. I think practically everybody who looks at this thing in detail is embarrassed and mortified by what seems to be going on with a sheer waste, with the billions of dollars that software companies pay for other people's software war chests, with the lawsuits going on, the patent trolls trolling everybody and extracting all kinds of rents for them on the threat of essentially the imposition of various forms of violence against them. The whole thing is out of hand. And there's been a lot of proposals for reform of the law, like maybe we should make copyright not last for the lifetime of the author plus 70 years. Well, I agree with that. We shouldn't have that. That's a preposterous system. I'm mortified when I think about what's happened to intellectuals. I get, as a publisher of Laissez Faire, I get notes all the time from authors who write me and say, gosh, my book, the publisher is selling it for like $700 on Amazon, and I would like to see this book distributed more broadly. Can you help me? And I always dread these kinds of notes to me because, I don't want to have to tell the truth to these people. And the truth is that I can't help them. And I know this because I've had too much experience in this area. The publishers will typically never give up, and especially not with the advent of print-on-demand technology. They will not give up their copyrights. They will not give up their rights to continue to be the sole distributor of this work. And the authors are usually shocked. They're like, what the heck kind of thing is this? I mean, I wrote this book. Why can't I be the decision maker? Well, look back at your contract. Well, I own the copyright. Well, okay, you own the copyright, but guess what? That's meaningless because the distribution rights belong to an industrial monopolist, and you have no access to those words. Well, those were my words, right, but you gave them away. And you don't have access to those things. Well, how long is this going to go on? Well, it's going to go on until you die, and probably, maybe, until your children die, and then maybe your great-grandkids can take possession of your work and put it into the commons. So lifetime plus 70 years. It's just beyond belief. And the same thing with patents. In the case of the patents laws, it's not so much been the extension of the terms as been the proliferation of ever more patents. So, seeds come under patents, copyrights came under patents. They didn't, software came under patents. It didn't used to be. Things that didn't used to have any patentable qualities to them at all have been rolled into this apparatus of intellectual property through specific legislation. it's a fascinating thing to me because there's all kinds of sectors in society that don't operate off patents and copyrights at all, and yet are thriving. To give one example, in the US, and I'm not sure what the European law looks like, it's probably the same, you can't copyright a recipe. Like if I tell you how to make biscuits right now, well, you take some flour and some lard and some salt and some sugar and you kind of blend them together and cook them in the oven for 12 minutes at 450 degrees. That's my recipe. If I try to copyright that, it would be invalid. You can't copyright a recipe. Recipes belong in the commons. I don't know, matter of tradition, I don't know. Maybe the recipe lobby is not strong enough. I don't know what's going on here. But anyway, you can't copyright a recipe. And yet, I can go down to the local bookstore and see a whole shelf of recipe books for sale. Now, how's this possible? Recipes are in the commons. I mean, how's anybody able to sell these things? Well, take a closer look, and what you find is that what you get in these individual books is not just recipes, but beautiful pictures, inspiration, motivational talks about how cool and sort of Spanish you will be if you make this cool dish, you know, or here's this Greek food that was eaten in the ancient world, and you too can make it at home, and here's a beautiful picture of it. You know, so these are the marketable commodities. So the industry works. Everything's fine. Nobody's panicked about the meltdown of recipes. Nobody will ever write a recipe again. You know, nobody who publishes recipes will make $1 again. You know, the commerce is surviving. It's not a problem. Once again, this thing keeps going out just as I get going. So commerce is surviving. And another case is the fashion industry, which you can't copyright, you can't patent in the fashion industry, and yet it's the boomingest, thrivingest, you know, most fabulous thing ever. You can't copyright sports, plays. Anyway, I'll stop there. But there's all kinds of industries that are doing extremely well in the absence of IP. Not just in spite of not having IP, but precisely because there's no IP, they're especially competitive and especially progressive and developing and changing all the time. So what is the key to commerce in the digital age? The key to commerce in the digital age, because obviously you have an infinite number of products, nobody's going to pay for your product if you can get it for free, right? At least that's the claim. I don't think that's quite correct, because you look at something like iTunes. Almost everything that I can download on iTunes, I can also get for free. Almost every movie I rent, you know, from the Redbox or through iTunes or buy from Amazon, I can also stream. So it's not incompatible to both charge for something and also be able to get it free. But let's be clear on our terminology here. When I say download a song from iTunes, that's not really what you're doing. We use that term colloquially in a casual sort of way, but that's not actually what's happening. What's happening is you're paying a user fee for the right to use a service in a particular way. That's what's being charged for. Because otherwise it wouldn't make any sense. I mean, if you can get something for free, why would you pay for it, right? But what you're getting, actually, when you download, pay for a movie download from iTunes, or for that matter, pay for any digital good, is access to a service, which saves you a lot of time and energy. And you know, iTunes didn't really take off until they figured out how to reduce the price enough to make it compatible with consumer desires. So, in other words, in the digital age, you can distribute these non-scarce goods at a fee if you can scarcify the service of delivery itself. This is rather ingenious. Another example is, you know, of course, everybody wants to point to Google, and I think it's a good example. How does Google make money? They give their #1 main product, which is search. They give it away for free. They give vast amounts of things for free. For God's sake, they made an operating system to run tablets, and it's an open source operating system. It's doing very, very well. So where does Google make money? Well, what they do is they give away the non-scarce good, which is the search, you know, and anything else they want to make. They want to just defer to its non-scarce properties, and they sell the scarce thing, which is advertising. Namely, the space on your computer screen is a scarce good, so they can sell that, and through advertising, they've become, you know, the Google we all know. They also are able to sell, you know, greater degrees of access to their own server space and that sort of thing. And that's a great way to make money. There's no one, you know, surefire method to making money in the digital age that works everywhere, but everybody has a rule of thumb. You have to find some way to either find the scarce thing and sell that at a price, or scarcify the non-scarce thing and sell that at a price. Another thing that's happening is fascinating to me now, because I don't believe that IP has like a future at all. I mean, this stuff is going down. The patent bubble is probably already popped. There's no chance of enforcing. I don't care how many people they throw into jail or how many people they arrest. The intellectual property laws are essentially unenforceable over the long term. So what's happening is that industries are starting to use the existence of piracy to help themselves. A good example is Nike when they come out with the tennis shoe maker. When they come out with new tennis shoes, and they come out with 45 different styles, what they do is they have people placed in various parts of the world to see which tennis shoes the pirates are pirating first, as a way of measuring their degree of popularity. Then they know what production lines to kind of push and which ones to pull back on, which things are succeeding, and this is information extraction. So companies have learned how to use pirate markets as a way of extracting information. Ultimately, the decision whether you want to share something or keep it private is a management decision. And in this respect, I wanted to separate myself from people on the left who believed, this old slogan, information wants to be free. Well, that's actually not apodictically certain. In some ways, if you're running a company, your information wants to be scarce. But the problem is you have to find a way to scarcify it. This is what software makers have done with special codes that you add. But by adding, you can probably pirate the same software, but without the code, you're not going to be able to get the service or the upstage you need. So that's the scarce good. The non-scarce good is the software itself. It works for them. Some companies have discovered tremendous advantages in sharing as a way of kind of subsidizing their other products. And a good example is the Android operating system, which is given away for free. It's an open source program, and they make money from other things, from the deep involvement of the app economy, from Google Play, which supports, other aspects of the business. It's a little bit tricky, but it seems to work fine. Another good example is the WordPress web hosting service, which is obviously open source. And so what's the sellable good? Well, sellable good is the customization that goes along with it. Whether you were going to give away the non-scarce good or scarcify the non-scarce good in order to sell it is really a decision of management. It's not a matter of justice. It's not a matter of property rights. It's a matter of how you're going to go about making money. So there are advantages to sharing and disadvantages to sharing. Not having IP actually doesn't make any difference really at all. It's unclear to the extent to which anybody these days is even benefiting from IP. I think about the case of Apple, their massive lawsuit against Samsung, which was just an outrage really, because it was all about the cosmetic features of the phone. I mean that was what it was all about. Meanwhile, Apple's busy emulating Samsung's design of the iPad, the miniature tablet computers. But look what happened to its stock price ever since that lawsuit came down and the jury decided in favor of Apple. I mean, the whole stock price has gone down, and now the whole world's talking about, oh my goodness, is Apple becoming less innovative? Is it becoming less creative? Why is it losing so much market share to Samsung? Why does it seem to be behind the curve? Well, I'll tell you why it's behind the curve, because it started to live on IP rather than actually innovating and doing cool stuff. Another point that I want to make here, and then I know I need to turn to questions. I love this topic. The pirates, it takes a certain level of entrepreneurship to be able to pirate things. People say to me all the time, like, well, you can't live in a world without copyright because then people just steal your book. Well, the thing is, the pirates can't steal every book. They have to know which book to steal. So how do you know which book to steal? Well, you have to look at the successful things to know what to steal. I mean, not everybody's as good an pirate entrepreneur as the people who are reproducing Nike tennis shoes. I mean, most pirates have to take cues from the market to know what they're going to pirate. By the time they get around to taking those cues, the first producer has the first advantage. And this is very much an important feature of the market. The first one to market has a great advantage over the people who are coming in second and third. I mean, even to this day, Bayer aspirin, which is like an 80-year-old product or something like that, sells more than any other brand. Okay, yeah. So let me just finish here with just a few comments about new innovations. I mentioned earlier about .com, Kim.com. He's come up with a new website, Mega Upload. It's called simply Mega. Double encrypted technology that is going to unleash, file sharing unlike anything we've ever seen. So long as the internet survives, it's going to be the world's greatest copying machine, and there's nothing the state can ever do about it. IP is utterly doomed. If you have a business model that depends heavily on the enforcement of IP, let me just say that I would sell the stock. My final comment is this. I know that this whole lecture, which has gone by so quickly, at least to my mind, has been about intellectual property, but I think the topic is not just important for its own right. I do think it's important, but I think it's important because it helps us learn something about the market and its functioning that we may not have understood before. Namely that the ability to copy and the ability to learn and emulate the success of others is an integral feature of the competitive marketplace. It goes on every day. And if you look at the theory of competition carefully, you see what's going on here. High profits in one sector, in one line of production, work as a signal to other entrepreneurs and other capitalists to chase those profits and, again, I'm sorry, to chase those profits and invade that territory and reduce them down to, reduce the marginal revenue down to the marginal cost. I mean, that's the way competitive markets are supposed to work. But a key linchpin here is the ability to share, to extract information, and emulate the behaviors of others. This feature of the market has not always been emphasized in market liberal literature. And I think the reason is that this topic of IP, the opposite world, in which essentially copying and emulating is illegal, has not really been present to us into the digital age. So we have some work to do, not just in the world of, in the area of IP, but in our theory of how markets work. And that's why I think this topic is so important. Well, thank you for inviting me today. I definitely feel like I've gone over time. But I do have time for questions, so I look forward to hearing them.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. There are already a few questions. Oh, Jeffrey, could you please turn down your volume a little bit, because I can hear myself.
How's that?
Thank you. I think that's better. Okay, firstly, a question from Jan. Isn't the question of IP really the question of positive versus natural law? If positive law is legitimate, then IP is legitimate also. But if natural law is the right way of looking at law, then IP is not legitimate.
Yeah, okay, that's an interesting way to put it. I wouldn't necessarily agree with you, though, because you can imagine a world in which positive law were totally compatible with the natural law, or maybe you don't believe in natural law and you just think that positive law should protect property rights. I think even if a person who didn't believe in natural rights, didn't believe in natural law, just looked at a kind of utilitarian case for the kind of legislation we should have defending only property rights, IP fails on those grounds, on consequentialist grounds, on every grounds. I don't think that there's, even on positive law grounds, reason to support intellectual property under any conditions. I really think that IP is just a mistake. It's an anti-competitive error that the state has made. The state has made many mistakes in its history, so it's hardly surprising. What's annoying about this one is just how much it persists, and I think the reason it persists so heavily is because of those who benefit from it, namely the most important, most powerful players. Typically the way IP works is that if you're just starting off a new business and you're the little guy who's trying to make a go of it, you're annoyed by IP and you're against it, But as you grow and then you become dominant, suddenly you fall in love with IP. You're like, hey, I have a right to my innovation. People should stop copying me. This is exactly what happened with, of course, Steve Jobs, who was famously said that to innovate is to steal, or something like that. He said, great artists, forget now the line. I think he's quoting Picasso. But anyway, his point is that great artists steal, and he was a big proponent of copying. But then once he became the dominant player, suddenly he's threatening nuclear war against, everybody else. So anyway, I would just in sum say that I don't think there's any solid grounds for IP at all. Let me add here, while I'm thinking about it. This whole lecture, I'm acting like this stuff is all my own ideas. It's nonsense. I mean, I'm very much a student of Stefan Kinsella, whose article on this topic is actually a book, and you can get it in the Laissez Faire Club. By the way, just subscribe to Laissez Faire Club. We'll send it right to you. His book came out in the 90s. I read it. It took me 6 years to come around to his opinion. Another very influential thinker on me and my understanding of property rights is actually Hans Hermann Hoppe, whose essay in The Great Fiction actually explains this difference between scarce and non-scarce goods. So I've got a lot of intellectual debts here. I don't want to just act as if this is all my own stuff.
Okay, another question from Luis. What is the best rebuttal to without IP law, incentives would be drastically diminished due to potential profits from the creation of the IP? Right.
Well, I think the answer to that is that, mostly the profits that accrue from IP enforcement goes to those people who have already innovated and not to those people who are actually innovating. That's just the practical reality. The second thing is that innovating is just sort of what humanity does. I mentioned, all the great composers from Beethoven never used IP. Brahms never used IP. Shakespeare never used IP. There's always been writing, always been art, always been people wanting to find ways to do things a better way. And that's because, why is that? Why is that? It's because we live in a world of scarcity where none of us can get enough, and none of us are really ever satisfied. We're always looking for better ways. The market economy does provide an incentive, a kind of reward for successful, economically viable innovations, but that reward is not in perpetuity, and it's not over 12 years or 20 years or 170 years, whatever is defined by the government. The reward lasts as long as people like your stuff instead of somebody else's stuff. That's the reward that the market offers for innovation.
Another question from Alexander. How would you imagine the music industry to make use of the first mover's advantage you often refer to?
Yeah, well, there's some very interesting, I'm learning too, one of the cool things about markets is that they always surprise you. Back when Napster came along, and I actually remember Napster. You log in, oh my gosh, all music was just available for you. And I was really excited about it. The music industry was panicked. There are a lot of people blame Napster for its loss of profitability, the music industry's loss in profitability. Actually, I don't think that necessarily that was to blame. What was going on was that there was a huge change in the way music was being distributed. We were going from an analog age to a digital age, and of course the big players in the market were just trying to catch up. They are supposed to, in a free market, see lower profitability as a signal to change, to innovate and find new ways to make money. Instead, they saw the existence of, they demonized this poor guy who came up with Napster and shut him down. It was all just kind of trying to find scapegoats for a lack of innovation, essentially. What I find very interesting about watching the way markets are developing is that they're coming up with solutions for things like music distribution that I never would have come up with myself. Like 2 years ago, YouTube was slamming down, any attempts to put up anything under copyright, using bots to do this. And it was nothing. It was very common that you would go to a site, to a YouTube video and see that a takedown had occurred. Or, my favorite examples when they'd show, teenagers trying to sing a pop song, and YouTube would actually blank out the audio because they're like singing somebody's pop song, so I have to blank it out so you wouldn't be stealing the song. You know, this is the way things were going. Well, that's not going on anymore. What's happening is a great deal of tolerance is being exercised now by the industry itself, because they realize making enemies of their customers is not a good idea. But they've developed bots that allow the industry to actually put advertisements, you know, seeing these uploads as being basically an opportunity to advertise their product, but then adding the advertisements to those YouTubes, and then that advertising revenue going back to the company itself. And I just mentioned that as one example because YouTube's become the new Napster. I mean, you can get almost anything up there. You know, the prominence of parody videos, which are just all over the place. And nowadays there's a thin line between parody and cover. You know, what exactly is the difference between a parody and a cover? Nobody really knows. These are all using loopholes in the law as a way of getting information out there. Industry is becoming ever more tolerant towards this because they're seeing that, you know, the internet can be their friend. And I think iTunes itself is a good example of that. Spotify, which I know Europeans are a lot more into Spotify than Americans. Americans are just now getting the hang of it. Pandora is another example. I mean, there's lots of different ways that music works. Exactly, as I said at the beginning, exactly what the profitability model is, that's something that has to be discovered by the market. I know that, you know, I'm a writer, and what I've found is that, you know, I just on the margin earn more from speaking than from writing probably, and my writings actually serve as a kind of advertisement for my speaking gigs, you know. So, you know, there are different goods, and in the case of most bands, they've learned that, many bands have learned that giving away their material in the best way they possibly can gets them more concert engagements, and that's the way they make their money. So in other words, I don't have all the answers, and there's a multiplicity of answers. Most of these have to be discovered by the markets. And that, I think, I'm glad you raised this point, this is really one of the terrible things about IP, is that it's disabled this discovery system that the market would normally have to come up with new innovations for distributing non-scarce goods. And the classic example here is books. I mean, they're still trying to force copyright. It's pathetic, and it's embarrassing. If we hadn't had copyright for books, we'd probably have a lot better systems for distribution on books that are actually profitable, like, you know, maybe books on tablets, computers would have rotating ads within them. You know, and every 20 pages there would be an ad, and if you click on the ad, there's ad revenue that would go to the author, to the company that published the book, to go to the author. None of these things are happening, and one of the reasons they're not happening is because the developments of these systems has been delayed because everybody's trying to make this rusty old cruddy system of copyright work. That's one of the worst things about IP, is it's actually injured profitability by diminishing the incentive to come up with new and innovative ways to make commerce work in a digital age. We have to make commerce work in the digital age. If we don't do this, we're sunk. I mean, we can't unplug our computers. We're not going to unplug the internet. The digital age is here to stay, so we've got to come up with new ways of managing it and stop being reactionaries about it. I'm really hopeful that that free market thinkers and market-oriented classical liberals will start thinking seriously about these topics, because it does no good to just keep saying, oh, let's have the state enforce these laws, because it's not going to work, and it hasn't worked, and it's not going to work in the future.
Okay, next question from Chad. In discussion of intellectual property laws, trademarks are very rarely mentioned. But what is to prevent a separate basement operation from bottling dirty water and label it, for example, Coca-Cola? Would this be a form of fraud that could be resolved in the courts?
Yeah, I'm glad that somebody brought up trademarks, because I typically don't address the topic. The answer is pretty easily summarized in this. We don't need trademarks. Trademarks are weird. I don't know if you know about how you have to actually apply for them. You can't just, like, I can't call something, you know, whatever, Jeff's tie, and prevent people from calling their tie Jeff's tie, without applying to the government for a trademark, which lasts a very short term. It's like 2-4 years, something like that, and then you have to reapply and pay this fee. Trademarks are very strange. You can get rid of trademarks entirely and replace them with anti-fraud legislation. So Nobody can market something called Jeffrey's tie if it's not actually Jeffrey's tie, right? Because that's like ripping people off. So anti-fraud statutes, the normal, kind of statute you have. If you lie to me and you sell me something, then we got a problem. Okay, so that covers the whole issue of trademark. And it's funny and interesting to me that you brought up the case of Coca-Cola, because Coca-Cola has been dealing with this whole issue of fake Coke now for like a century. When they first came out with the great innovation of Coke, which I understand had some cocaine in it, wow. People would, you can reverse engineer anything. It's just not a new technique, it's an old technique. And so people would reverse engineer it, market their own thing, and call it Coca-Cola. Well, this is a big problem for the company. I mean, you can only enforce anti-fraud measures so much. I mean, eventually you have to come up with an innovation to disincentivize this, or somehow make something unique about your product. So what Coke did is they wanted to make people feel bad if they weren't drinking the real Coke and they're drinking a fake. So the slogan, "It's the real thing," comes out of that experience. But more importantly, that the shape of the bottle, that at least in the U.S. is still around, that really fancy looking shape. The Coca-Cola company spent a lot of money developing bottle manufacturing that was very expensive and unique, that none of the pirate Coca-Colas could actually replicate. So immediately then they have a product that's recognizable as Coca-Cola, and people could tell the difference between the real and the fake. And that's what shut down the pirate Coke industry, not the enforcement of any statutes or lawsuits or anything like that, but just sheer market innovations. So yeah, I think we can get rid of trademark, and we should get rid of trademark too, and just replace them with anti-fraud legislation. Most of the pirate goods that are being taken down, like to start a website selling fake iPhones or whatever, and my website is removed, most of the so-called counterfeit goods, the consumers know good and well that they're not real. Like if I go out on the street and buy a Rolex watch for $2, I know for sure that I'm not buying a Rolex watch. Nobody has been really defrauded. I mean, there's been no violence take place. There's been no lies. It's not really fraud. Gucci handbags, Nike, shoes, all these things. So you have to make a distinction between, known errors and fraud. And consumers like to buy things that look really high status. Most of the companies, fashion companies that have dealt with this topic, have discovered that they're cracking down on the fake products really doesn't pay. It costs more to enforce it than you get in benefit. The other thing is that these fake products can serve as advertising too. I mean, you're getting your name brand out there, and that's not really a problem. There are market means for dealing with these things. But anyway, that's my answer to the trademark question.
Next question from Mike, a short one. What would you suggest to workers of a firm that relies heavily on IP?
Yeah, okay, so this is a big problem. A lot of the reliance on IP these days, especially patents, is not because the firm is really like dedicated to the patent or something. It's because they've had to take out patents to protect themselves against others who would patent the same product that they're selling and put them out of business. I mean, it's a vicious cycle that goes on. I mean, if you could somehow get every industrial, especially in the software world, together in one room and everybody agree, let's get rid of patents, most everybody would say, yeah, thank God, these things are a big pain in the neck. I'd rather just innovate, But they can't do that because they're afraid. They're afraid of their competition, and they want the right to produce things, so they have to take out a patent. So just because a firm is using a patent or even enforcing a patent doesn't make it bad. It's the world we live in, unfortunately. I don't think that sometimes patents can actually hurt companies. I was talking last year about this time in San Diego to a really impressive web entrepreneur who had a lot of experience in the app industry and software. And he said that they don't ever want to get a patent for anything, because if you spend all your time and your money and your attention on getting the patent, he says it biases your developers, that they get sort of like attached to a certain way of doing things, thinking that that's what they have to patent in, so that's what they have to do. Whereas he told me, he said, this industry moves too fast. A patent is actually damaging, and it's actually dangerous to you as an enterprise because it weds you to a line of thinking from the past, whereas I, as an entrepreneur, he's telling me, I need to wake up every day ready to do something completely new, to blow up the old and revolutionize the world. And so I don't want any patents around me because it prevents me from doing that. I'm also very suspicious of companies that throw their whole heart and soul into patent enforcement. To me, it suggests that it's not an innovative company. So there's no one answer to this question, what should workers do in these lines? But it depends. It really depends on how reliant the company truly is on that. And sometimes there could be misnomers about this. People think that Monsanto, for example, the feed company and the seed company, is desperately reliant on its patents. If it didn't have those, it would be washed up. Yeah, I don't really believe that. I think Monsanto is big and enormously wealthy because they sell stuff to people that they like. The patents don't really do them that much good. I would say the same thing about Microsoft. I mean, if Windows weren't a patented technology, would Microsoft still have the incentive to keep it a trade secret? I don't want to use the word trade secret. To keep it secret. I would say probably so. Would they succeed? Probably they would figure out a way. In the same way that Google keeps its search algorithms private, I mean, they're probably patented too. I don't actually know. Probably not, actually. They're able to manage to keep their secrets. There's nothing wrong with industrial secrets. Innovators like to keep things quiet. I know in the video game industry, for example, it's a very interesting thing. I got a note the other day from a big-time developer in the video game industry. He said that when the developers are writing these programs and when they're developing the games, that there's like utter and total secrecy. It's like working for the CIA or something, I mean, you can't go home and talk to your spouse about the video game. Like, nobody's allowed to talk about it at all, especially not with like colleagues and friends and much less competitors. I mean, it's total secrecy, and there's an ethos that's developed in that world, not so much through contract, but just a matter of an industrial norm that you never talk about the video game that you're developing until it's actually out there on sale. So when it goes out there, then it's this big splashy event. And if you do violate that industrial norm, then you're going to find yourself out of a job and probably not able to get another one. So that's very interesting to me. That's I think the way things work in the real world. So any company that's totally dependent on patents, it's probably not long for this world anyway.
Okay, there are still a lot of questions to go, but I'm afraid we won't be able to discuss them all. So I'll conclude with this one from Kelvin. You talked before about Rothbard's argument of copyrights being possible on a contractual basis. Do you agree with this, and do you think such contracts would ever be feasible?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question. I agree with it. Any kind of contract is possible. The problem is calling it copyright because essentially there's no such thing as common law copyright. I mean, if it's copyrighted state, there's state and copyright just go together. Would there be the kind of contracts that would restrict the end user? I think it depends on the industry. Like, for example, if I went into the grocery store and they had potatoes for sale, and the guy stopped me and said, just one quick thing about that potato. This batch of potatoes can only be served mashed, and that's the only way you can. And I said, well, wait a minute, but I want to like slice them and fry them. No, I'm sorry, sir. If you buy this potato, we've got a contract here that says you can only mash it. So if you do anything else with this potato, we've got a problem with you. Okay, now would I go ahead and buy this? I might think it's weird. I might, but my guess is that potatoes that have multi-uses are going to, sorry for the silly example, are going to be more competitive in the market than potatoes that are contractually sold with only single uses. I don't want to predict exactly what market contracts could or couldn't look like. But I do think that any kind of contract that severely restricts what the actual owner of the thing can do are probably not going to be as successful as those that are more liberal with what the owner can do, which is one of the things that's very interesting about, for example, technologies that when you buy ebooks now, they're, because of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, you're not able to copy and paste out of them, a lot of them. And by the way, Laissez Faire Club, we publish entirely into the commons, so we don't use any kind of those crazy restrictions on our books. I find them offensive. But I think in a real true free market, companies that wouldn't let you copy and paste out of their books are going to lose out to those that do, just simply because the consumers want to copy and paste out of their books. So I think heavily restrictive copyrights would just tend to lose the competitive battle, which is why they're always going to the government for protection. Thank you. Well, I guess that's the last question. Was kind of makes me sad because I mean, as you could probably tell, I could sit here like all day dealing with these topics. I love this topic. I hope you start thinking about it. Read Kinsella's book. Read Bourbon and the Vine's great book called Against Intellectual Monopoly, which you can get free online. I hope that some of you that are listening will get to work on this topic and start revisiting the history of ideas in the liberal tradition to examine attitudes towards not just this topic of copyright and patents and intellectual property, but towards the larger theme of the role of learning in the development of economic life. I mean, to me, that's the big thing that needs to be covered. I mean, this is the uncharted territory. I know Hayek talks about it a little bit, Mises talks about it. You've got little pieces here and there, but there's a lot of work to do to plug some of these holes that, to my mind, exist in market theory. So I hope that this seminar, inspires some thought into you to think more seriously about this area. I think there's a lot of intellectual innovations that have yet to undergo. So as important as IP is, what's really important is this broader subject that it points to. And to me, there's just a lot of work to do. And I'm grateful to you for listening, and you're welcome to write me anytime at tucker@lfb.org. You can contact me through Facebook or Twitter also. And thank you again, European Students for Liberty, for having me today. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for doing this webinar. I just wanted to mention one question we received, Red. Do you have any problems with people copying your books? But I think that's quite obvious now.
Yeah, the more you can distribute of my stuff, the happier I am. People have asked me, it's like, well, you're running a club that has like a cover charge to get. Well, I want to provide a good service, and I don't want people to feel like they're not getting a good service, like, oh, well, I have to be a member of the club to get that book. Well, I would rather provide, a really nice community that people really want to belong to because they want to be there, not because I'm somehow twisting their arms, if you know what I mean. So that's why we publish into the commons. The more you can copy and distribute my own work, of course, the happier you make me. So.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. I would like to conclude just a few more, well, actually one big announcement. That is, of course, the fact that we are organizing our second European Students for Liberty conference from the 8th to the 10th of March in Leuven, Belgium. That's near Brussels. But then again, everything is near Brussels in Belgium. But anyway, on the 31st, so in 2 days, the registration fees goes up. So until then, you still have the opportunity to pay 30 euros if you're a student and 45 euros if you're a non-student. And that includes all your meals, that includes all the conference material, free books, all the lectures. So you're free to check out our website. You will receive an email after this webinar to ask you some feedback, but also some information about the SFLC. So I do urge you to consider this. If you want a life-changing event in Europe and the biggest gathering of classical liberal students, then this is the event for you. Then I will conclude by thanking you all for listening in tonight, and hopefully we'll see you soon at the SFLC, or at least until the next webinar, which will be on the 26th of February. Then we'll have Lawrence Reed, president of FEE, who will be talking about liberty and character. Until then, good night everyone, and keep fighting the good fight.
The organ